Good morning, metalheads of the internet. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we are looking at the latest album from Trivium entitled What the Dead Men Say. I have very mixed feelings for Trivium. I mean, on one hand, they're one of the more musically flexible bands to come out of the new wave of American heavy metal, having played around with melodic metalcore, traditional heavy metal, thrash metal, alternative metal. They've even fooled around with some more progressive ideas on albums like Shogun and In Waves, and as recently as The Sin in the Sentence played around with black metal influences, that album even featuring Ishan as a credited songwriter. And on top of all that, Matt Heafy himself is one of the nicest, most genuine dudes in all of heavy metal. Even if you don't like a single Trivium song, this is the kind of guy you want to sit down and have a fucking beer with. He's just a really great dude. But on the other hand, the quality of their music varies greatly from album to album, to the point where it seems as though for every good album the band releases, a bad one very shortly follows. For instance, I really like the aforementioned Sin in the Sentence. I would go as far as to say that it's probably the band's best record, but the preceding record before that, Silence in the Snow, hate that fucking record. I think it's shit. I think part of the reason why there's been such an inconsistent streak in the quality of the band's music has to do with the inconsistent style on display in the band's music. I mean, it's great that they're flexible, it's great that they're diverse, it's great that they've pulled from all of these genres, but very rarely do they take a lot of time to really develop any of these sounds and refine them, oftentimes crudely pasting them onto records and simply hoping that the individual influences themselves will turn out just fine. To be fair, sometimes it does. For instance, The Crusade borrows heavily from vintage Metallica, and as such, kind of works. But of course, just as occasionally, this also backfires. Take, for instance, on the David Draymond-produced Vengeance Falls, which has way too much of a disturbed flavor for my personal liking. At this point, it even seems as though the only thing truly consistent about Trivium is the inconsistency in quality and style, which itself is another reason to be very concerned when it comes to a new Trivium record. But I remained very optimistic, as early reviews for this record were incredibly positive, and I did mostly enjoy some of the promo singles that had come out. And on top of that, I couldn't help but objectively be a little bit more curious upon realizing that Trivium was one of the few major metal bands that hadn't postponed or indefinitely delayed a new album in the wake of COVID-19. In this moment, I kind of felt, well, if Trivium is confident enough to release this album in the midst of a global pandemic while everyone else backs away, then clearly there must be some seriously amazing shit on here. Which is why I was all the more disappointed when I very quickly realized that What the Dead Men Say was not going to rise to the level of Sin in the Sentence or rank with Trivium's better works, instead falling more in line with some of the more forgettable and contemporary works from the band. Still suffering from a bit of an identity crisis, still suffering from a little bit of internal confusion about what musical direction they need to take. Putting Trivium in a spot that would have been forgiving in 2004, but really concerning in 2020 on their 9th studio album. Title track What the Dead Men Say is a fantastic example of everything I'm talking about, as Trivium take a fairly common 4-chord rock progression that many bands in the past have been able to sculpt into something effective and pleasing, and instead bombard it with these Gojira-esque slides and riffs, this massive, obnoxious, Disturbed-style chorus, minor flashes of thrash and melodic death metal, and perhaps one of the weakest breakdowns that Trivium have ever implemented into a song. It's like a very clumsy smorgasbord of all of these styles and sounds that Trivium have previously tapped onto over the years. It's as if these guys were in the studio and they looked at all of their previous records and they said, what kind of style do we want to go for? And Matt Heafy just went, yes, out loud, and then left the room and failed to indulge the rest of Trivium as to what his plan was. Following track Catastrophist keeps this confused, muddled ball rolling with a fairly simplistic melodic metalcore structure that very quickly evolves into something a lot more abrasive, something a lot more stark, something that feels much more in tune with early 2000s In Flames or some of the more melodic material from Cataclysm, even packing a pretty lame and radio-friendly chorus that very easily could have been lifted from a Black Veil Bride song. Hell, there's even a brief moment near the end of the track where Matt kind of sings to himself over some radio static, and it actually does sound a lot like Andy Biersack of Black Veil Brides. And while Trivium eventually removed some of the ingredients from this album's recipe, the flavor still feels kind of confused and directionless at times. Take, for instance, Amongst the Shadows and the Stones, which initially grabs your attention with its brazen, raucous, metallic hardcore, but eventually divulges into a pure wankfest almost on par with some of the antics we see in Avenged Sevenfold. Like, Trivium on this album are like the sonic equivalent to a kid who's eaten way too much fucking candy. And you just want to grab this kid and tell him to shut the fuck up and go to bed. For obvious reasons, this album is at its best when that kid has the candy taken away from him and is therefore forced to focus on the task at hand. Take, for instance, a track like Bending the Arc to Fear, which resettles on some of the metallic hardcore influences hinted at earlier in the album and blends it with more of an at-the-gates kind of stark death metal, resulting in some of the album's heaviest riffs, interesting arrangements, and most entertaining songs, period. Or on a track like The Defiant, which streamlines things even further down to a sound reminiscent of some of the band's earliest records, pulling from the classic metalcore structure and implementing some great, spicy thrash metal riffs. These moments may not rank among Trivium's best work, particularly as the album continues to cool down even further and settle into some serious filler material. Cough, cough, the insanely repetitive and hyper-simplistic Bleed Into Me, which is trying way too hard to be a stadium anthem. Cough, cough, not exaggerating on that repetitive bit either. Take a shot every time he says bleed and you'll be pissed drunk by the end of the song. Oh, man. Ooh, it's a weird cough. I gotta check that out. But at least they show some refinement and some maturity and don't sound as if you've just pressed shuffle on a Spotify playlist. Something that Trivium desperately need at this point. I mean, Sin in the Sentence was a step in the right direction, but come on, Trivium. It's time to settle on a sound. You should not be having an identity crisis when you've been existing for 21 years. You should not be having an identity crisis on album number 9. You just shouldn't. It's that simple. I'm unfortunately going to give this album a 2 out of 5. I'd like to go higher. I'd like to be more positive, especially since, at the end of the day, if anything, this does prove that Trivium at least still have a lot of fire and passion within them. On top of that, from a purely technical standpoint, the album is mixed okay. I mean, there's some issues like the bass guitar and the somewhat anticlimactic ending, but, other than that, it's not bad. It's a professionally produced record. But none of these things matter if you can't write a song. I mean, in their quest to touch all of these sub-genres and bring them into the Trivium world, they have forgotten that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you don't have a fucking song to back it up. I've got sections of great songs, I've got moments that could be developed into great songs, and I have a few good songs. But I don't really have any great, complete songs. Especially when you look back at Sin in the Sentence. I mean, that album was miles ahead of this. It feels as if it was made by a completely different band. I mean, I've no doubt the Trivium fans will still really enjoy this. They've put up with some really stupid shit over the years. But man, if I was brand new to this band, if this was my first Trivium record, this would really convince me not to check out some of their other records, regardless of what people may have said. Like, if I want to listen to Metallica, I'll just go listen to Metallica. If I want to listen to Killswitch Engage, I'll just go listen to Killswitch Engage. If I want to listen to Disturbed, I'll just go listen to Disturbed. I don't want to hear a hodgepodge of all of these sounds. I don't want to hear some kid bouncing back and forth between all of these songs hyped up on candy. I want to hear fucking Trivium. And unfortunately, they've let that fucking kid take the reins for now, and that's a big problem for me. 2 out of 5. It's poor. I wish it wasn't, but it is. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be. So what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Make sure you press subscribe right there so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.